Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. I've got a couple pieces of magazine news for you this week. First, my guest this week is Derek Mong, and in addition to being the author of the forthcoming poetry collection, When the Earth Flies into the Sun, Derek is, along with his wife, Ann Fisher, the new editor of At Length. So Jonathan Farmer, friend of the show, was the founding editor and longtime editor, poetry editor of At Length. He has passed it on now to Derek and his wife Ann, and they are running it out at Wabash College, Wabash University, Wabash Institute for Higher Ed. Whatever it is, they're running it out there now. Check it out. They publish long stuff there, and they publish things sort of slowly, one piece at a time. I think the most recent piece up now is an essay by Jonathan on Elizabeth Bishop that is well worth a read. It's got the title is something like and. I forget. It's about polysyndeton and other things in Elizabeth Bishop. Go look for that. At Length, Derek Mong, When the Earth Flies into the Sun. Derek and I are talking this week about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. And very briefly, I will also mention in other magazine news that there is a new issue of 32 poems out. I have a couple of poems at the end of this one of which I was surprised got published anywhere, particularly here, because I figured it might be a career ender, such as I have a career. That one you cannot read online. The other one you can read online. I think my favorite at the moment, I'm rereading it right now, is Chris Childers' poem There, which is a really lovely poem for his wife Sanaz. That is worth a read. I'll read very quickly a short poem. I read a poem by Chris on the Secret Show feed this week. So here's a different poem from the issue that I also quite like. It's called I Too Had a Childhood. It's by Eleanor Stanford. And it reminds me a little bit of... So we talk some about what Sylvia Plath contributed to contemporary poetry for good and ill. One of the things we did not talk about is that she's known as a confessionalist. I think one of the things she does, though, with her confessionalism is... It's sort of like as if Gabriel Garcia Marquez wrote magic realism. Plath wrote sort of like confessional surrealism or surreal confessionalism. She wrote about her own life, but in a way that it's like her own life was like that sequence at the beginning of Tree of Life where Jessica Chastain flies in Terrence Malick's memory. And this poem has a little bit of that feeling to it. I Too Had a Childhood by Eleanor Stanford. A sparrow got caught in the stove vent. I had a brother. Then another. My father cut a hole in the ceiling to let in the sky, to let in another brother. My mother bathed us in a tin tub in the yard. I was a junior safety patrol. I wore a fluorescent orange sash. The radio said something about hostages, something about the shining path. We believed we were living in a time of peace. I looked both ways. I waved the other children across. Popsicles dripped down our arms the color of nuclear sunset. We slept in flammable pajamas. Yeah, I think it's like it does a nice job of capturing the the often bizarre and sometimes inspired arbitrary juxtapositions that one experiences in childhood. And that I do think that Sylvia Plath really, if she didn't introduce them to contemporary poetry, she certainly was a prominent practitioner of the technique. I do like there's a possible typo in the poem, but I also kind of like it as a non-typo. I wore a fluorescent orange sash. There are two spellings of the word fluorescent. This one actually means bursting with flowers. But I sort of like that. I wore a fluorescent orange sash. It might as well have been bursting with flowers. We slept in flammable pajamas. Anyway, yeah, go check out 32 Poems, number 43, summer 2024, and you can buy a copy and read the last poem if you want to cancel me. All right, so as I said, I'm speaking this week to Derek Mong, editor of At Length, author of When the Earth Flies into the Sun, about Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes and Marjorie Perloff, the late, great Marjorie Perloff. We talk a little bit about her and what she contributed to criticism, but we also read two of her pieces about Ted Hughes and how much she fucking hates him. It is a lot of fun. And then in the second half of our conversation, which is going to be in the Secret Show feed, we talk some about Derek's philosophy editing at length. And we also talk about having kids and raising kids and dividing labor and making money and being a poet. And it is pretty frank. Like I was very glad to record it, and it felt close. It struck a nerve for me, and I hope it does for some of you. But you got to go on the Secret Show to hear that. It will be up later this week at SLEERICKETS.substack.com, or you can just go to SLEERICKETS.com, and there will be links to everything, including the Secret Show. All right, here is my conversation with Derek Mong. Would you, just for people who might have, I mean, I think pretty much everybody will at least know the rough outlines of Sylvia Plath's story, but would you give kind of an intro to like, what are we dealing with when, you said, for example, like, I'm not a Plath or Hughes partisan, and neither am I, but like, what are we even talking about from scratch as much as possible?
No, great question. So I'll do my best to sort of introduce this. So as probably most of your listeners know, and most people who read poetry, Sylvia Plath takes her own life on, I think it's early in the morning of February 11th, 1963. She's in an apartment in London. It is one of the coldest winters within a generation of when it happens. Her children are with her. They're in another room. She seals the door. She turns on the gas on the oven. One of the things that I learned while doing some of this reading about this, not just during this for this podcast, but when I was in graduate school, was that there was actually a number of moments where leading up to that successful suicide, obviously she tried to take her own life earlier, were some of the things that she did to try to save herself. She wrote a note that had a doctor's number on it. She had left a message with an au pair to come find her, but the au pair arrived and the door was locked and wasn't able to get in. She had tried to check herself into a psychiatric hospital the week before, but there were no beds. So there are all these steps apparently that Plath had sort of taken to try to sort of find her way out of this really difficult situation. And of course, she and Ted Hughes had just separated. She discovered in, I think it's summer of the year before, 1962, that Hughes was having an affair with a woman whose name I've never quite known how to pronounce. Asa Weevil, Asa Weevil.
Assia, or Assia, I think it's spelled.
Yes. Is it pronounced Assia?
Oh, I don't know, but it's Assia, I think is the spelling at least. Yeah.
So obviously there's tension there. Hughes is living elsewhere. Plath is on her own. She's writing poems at a feverish pace leading up to the moment of her death. There are days where she's writing 3 poems a day. There's a spate of time early in October of 1962 where she produces some really phenomenal work within about 10 days. There's about 7 poems that are produced between roughly like October 1st and October 10th. So in any case, that's some of the backstory. When she dies, she leaves 2 children, Frida and Nicholas, and a manuscript, which is what Marjorie Perloff is interested in looking at in this essay that we read, which is called The Two Ariels, the Remaking of the Sylvia Plath Canon. So she dies, Plath dies intestate and has not appointed a literary executor, so far as I know. So Hughes becomes her literary executor.
Also, like very prominent poet, but she was an American poet, he was a British poet. They're both very prominent. He was probably, if anything, during their marriage, the more prominent. Ariel comes out after her death and is an immediate and huge sensation. So this is her posthumous collection, the collection she was putting together when she died. And as you said, this does not come out exactly as she left behind.
Right. Yes. Thank you. You're getting some important context here. Yeah. Hughes is better known. She had published one collection called The Colossus beforehand. She published The Bell Jar, a novel under a pseudonym. And this was the book that really kind of puts her on the map. Hughes takes the manuscript that apparently does exist in facsimile to this day because it's later published, and changes the order of the poems.
And adds a bunch and takes a few out.
Right. Takes a few out, adds other poems, and more or less has some free reign with what the book's arc looks like. Mm-hmm. We don't know that he's done this. So Ariel comes out in 1965 and 1966, in the US and in the UK separately. And we don't know that Hughes has done this until he publishes her collected poems in 1981, which he wins the Pulitzer Prize for posthumously. And in the back of that book, he puts together an appendix that has the original ordering of the Ariel poems. So he's the one who, does give us the information to show that he himself had changed the ordering. And that, I presume, is what...
in addition to giving the order, he also acknowledges what like his own editorial choices, as well as in her collected diaries. He says, "Oh, here are the ones I destroyed, and here's why, and here was my." So he does, many of the things that Perloff takes him to task for, he is the one who told us about these things, and seems to have done it at least with some degree of ambivalence. But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's absolutely right. Yeah, I mean, he gets a lot of crap, certainly from Perloff. Perloff is no fan of his in both this piece and then. She hates him. She hates him. And so we read this, and then we read her review of his birthday letters, which are poems that he publishes near the end of his life in 1997, 1998, which apparently, according to him, are all letters that he writes back to Sylvia Plath over the years of her birthdays that she doesn't celebrate because she's dead. And we could get into that later, but she hates that book even more, it seems like, than she hates what he did to Ariel. So in any case, he gives us the information that he has changed Ariel. Perloff then goes and rereads Ariel with the order that Plath had originally intended. And in this article, very helpfully provides competing tables of contents in the very beginning of the piece, and then provides dates of composition, and then does a close reading of the two sequences of Ariel, and comes to very different conclusions about the kind of book that has been created. Plath's Ariel, according to Perloff, is a book that moves from love, which is the first word of the book, to spring, which is the last word of the book. And there's hope there. It ends with these famous poems called the bee poems. And, it ends with storing some honey over the winter so that you can have something sweet later, with this presumption that you're going to return, you're going to, flourish again, things are going to be okay. Hughes's version that he publishes in the 60s does have those poems in it, but he adds in particular, and this is where sort of Perloff really, points her laser beams of criticism, he puts in 4 or 5 poems near the end of the book, which are all kind of fatalistic or make it appear as if Plath is doomed to commit suicide. They're very much about self-harm. The titles are Contusion, Edge. The final one, Words, ends really sort of darkly.
Something I was just looking at it. It ends with a line here. Words dry and riderless, the indefatigable hoof taps, while from the bottom of the pool fixed stars govern a life. So there is this sense of fate, and the impossibility of changing one's fate.
Right. So Perloff's argument then is that's great. So Perloff's argument then is that Hughes has put these poems at the end of the book to make it appear that Plath's suicide was inevitable, which then exculpates him from any guilt for having brought it upon Plath through having left her, having had this affair, presuming some amount of domestic work on her, that she's just going to sort of maintain the home while he gets to be the famous writer. And that's her claim. That Hughes has not just corrupted the Ariel, which I think is pretty clear that he does, but that he does it for his own public image and and obviously it totally blows up in his face because he's deeply hated by, I guess, if you want to use the term partisan Plathians. I don't know. I mean, this is one of the most heated, I think still to this day, sort of us versus them, certainly marriages in poetry, arguably sort of critical sort of worlds. I wonder if there's ever a conference where there are Ted Hughes societies in London, there are Ted Hughes fans. Like, do they ever occupy the same room? Because his name is so frequently defaced from her tombstone that I don't know what they do with it, but it's like it's always scratched out or graffitied over. Oh, so I'll jump ahead to like who kind of wins this argument. It feels to me that like Perloff in the end, to whatever extent, I'm using the finger air quotes of lame professors. Arguably, Perloff wins the argument because
and she publishes this. Just quickly, she publishes this essay, The Two Ariels, in 84 or 85. Is that right?
Right.
And then the Birthday Letters comes out in 97.
Right.
which is
Right.
Hughes' book of poems to Plath addressing all of that after the fact.
Yeah, and that book is, I remember when that book came out, when Birthday
Mm-hmm.
Letters comes out, it's
Me too.
huge.
Yeah.
I remember seeing it in Barnes and Nobles when I was probably 16 years old.
Yeah.
Hadn't
Yeah.
read
Yeah.
any Plath, hadn't read any Hughes, and it was way up there in the front, hardback, selling like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
gangbusters. And probably because it was, there's that sensationalism that, prurience, he had not talked
Yeah.
about Plath much during the latter half of his life. I think there wasn't a lot in it for him to do so. It would often lead to criticism.
No.
So no, right.
Yeah.
So in 2004, Harper Perennial publishes Sylvia Plath's The Restored Edition of Ariel, which restores the table of contents that Perloff maps out for us, also publishes a facsimile of the entire book. So it looks like about 2 books of poetry in length. Publishes the transcript of those famous BBC interviews that she does, not really interviews so much as introductions to the poems that she reads, which if you ever Google Sylvie Plath and you're looking for an audio, that's what you'll find. You'll find the BBC recordings, and they're quite haunting and beautiful. So those are in there. It's got a really interesting introduction by Frida Hughes, the daughter, and who's still alive today, is also a poet and an artist, lives in Australia. And then I just noticed this again. Way in the back, there is one of Frida's poems about Sylvia Plath that's basically a response to that movie that came out with Daniel Craig and Gwyneth Paltrow called
Yeah. Yeah.
Sylvia.
Yeah.
I don't know if you ever saw this.
I did. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's she's not a fan. And
Sure. Yeah.
it's basically you're, exhuming my mother to trot her out in front of you for your, what's the word? Your voyeurism,
Yeah.
you want to just look at their
I mean,
their
and I have to say,
bodies.
like, unlike this 2004 restored edition of Ariel, you're trotting out my dead mother in order to in order to make some money. Well, all right,
Right, right.
Yeah.
So I didn't realize this when I saw that movie, Sylvia. None of Sylvia Plath's poems are quoted in the movie
Hmm.
because Frida doesn't give, I assume, gosh, so I don't know this. And again, I'm not a Plath
Yeah.
scholar,
Yeah.
not a
Yeah.
Hughes scholar. I presume that Frida Hughes, the daughter, now has the rights to Ariel and to
Yeah. Yeah.
Plath's
Yeah.
work, because Hughes got it. When Hughes died, I presume it would have gone down to Frida.
Yeah.
Frida's brother Nicholas commits suicide, I think in 2009, which that
Yeah.
made news because
As
it
did,
was
I
another
believe,
suicide in the family.
Hughes' next wife, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken. A
That
lot of
I was
suicides in
telling
that
my wife
family.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he kills their daughter too.
Wait.
So he
He
kills,
kills. Sorry. What? Who?
yeah. So his second wife that he marries after Plath, who he was having an affair with while married to Plath,
Yeah.
they get together, they get married, and she commits suicide as well.
Yeah.
But she takes their 4-year-old daughter with her.
She kills their
I don't know if it's
daughter.
4.
Oh, sorry. Just to clarify,
She kills their
she
daughter.
kills. You said for a second he kills their daughter.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That was a
God,
Perloffian slip. Because Perloff
right.
seems to blame Hughes for all of the suicides. Yeah, good.
It
That's
is basically
horrifying.
his fault. Everybody's dead.
Jesus, that is. I didn't know that. That's horrifying.
I mean, I wonder how he. Yeah, I don't know how he made it through the world. Like he's
No.
It's like when people think about Joe Biden and the loss of his kids.
Yeah. This is true.
And how can you not have sympathy for that? I know it's very difficult for many people to have sympathy for Ted Hughes. But
and these days for Joe Biden sometimes as well. But that kind of loss is unimaginable. Yeah. Good.
So
good.
I don't know if that covers all the biographical basis.
I think so. And I mean, you're right. We don't know whether it was Frida Hughes' choice, but I mean, given the title, given the sensationalism, and given the familiarity of so many of her posthumous poems, I can't imagine that they would not have used the poems if they had had permission. Surely they would have used. Surely they wanted to use her poems in that movie, because they do quote other poems. I know there's some scenes of him reciting, and they talk about poetry a lot. But yeah,
I'm gonna see if I can find what she writes. Yeah, she's really not fond of the. Frida alleged publicly that the BBC had pestered her in hopes of securing rights to her mother's work. The film debuted in November 2003. It did not make use of its subject's poetry. Yeah, this poem's called My Mother. It appeared in March 2003 in Tatler. communicates Frida's displeasure with the BBC production Sylvia, starring Gwyneth Paltrow. So, and the first line is, "They are killing her again."
I mean, there's like there's like so much psychological anguish in this family in all direct, and like, I mean, Hughes is rightly taken to task for being a pretty awful husband, but like, Jesus Christ, there's so much misery in this family. Good
Yeah.
God. Yeah, so I have so many different mixed feelings about all of this. I'm curious, what was, before digging into all the Perloff stuff, what was your relationship with or sense of Plath and Hughes as poets? Like, what did they mean to you before this, if anything?
Very, very little, I think.
Yeah,
I
yeah, yeah.
I remember reading Plath dutifully as an undergraduate, feeling like she didn't talk to me. I remember she spoke to me on the level of mental health crisis, and
Mhm.
people I knew in my life who were suffering a mental health crisis, and reading the poems that were written months before, in some cases mere days before her suicide, and that being very hard to read because
Mhm.
people in my life were suffering, and it felt very, there's an extremity to her work.
Yeah.
I don't say this as a criticism, but it's a very, like, hyperbole is a part of her poetic persona and stance in those aerial poems. But other than that, I had very little relationship to them. I knew Hughes's poems only from, there was a wonderful hardback book that had 3 CDs encased in it that was like very pre-internet, because it was how you could hear poets read their work out loud, pre-YouTube. It's called Poetry Speaks, I think. And I listened to those CDs so many times driving. And Hughes's reading aloud of his poem Pike, and he's got another one about the Garden of Eden, where it's like Eve didn't eat the apple, the snake ate Eve. I can pull it up. But that, his rendition of that poem, those are magical. But that was it. And it wasn't until I was putting together my orals list, doing my PhD in American poetry, where I think somebody even said, you don't have Ariel on here. Like, what's
Mm.
kind of,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
criticism wise,
Yeah,
you really ought to have Ariel. That's an important book. And that's when I finally read it. And
yeah.
it's pretty stunning. It's also pretty uneven. There are poems in there that are amazing. There are poems in there that are super forgettable. It's in a lot of different verbal registers. Yeah, I mean, it's a book that I recognize its incredible influence over the course of 20th century American poetry. Without Ariel, we don't have, I mean, there's so many names. We don't have Sharon Olds. We don't have Anne Sexton. We
Yeah.
don't have, gosh, Deborah Landau, a contemporary poet
Yeah.
who I really adore. And the class ability to open up a previously maybe untended or less tended sort of field of writing about parenting, which became
Yeah,
really
yeah, yeah,
important to me
yeah.
when I had a kid, like that,
Yeah.
the kind of ambivalence or difficulty of being a parent.
Yeah. And even like
That I'm not sure.
pregnancy. Like,
Yeah,
that was the poem I best remember of hers from high school, was Metaphors, which is just about being pregnant. No, it's not all. I mean,
yeah,
she was like, she was an enthusiastic mother, but also, wrote about it honestly as well. And sometimes it was pretty miserable.
exactly. And that was really eye-opening to me when I became a dad, to
Yeah.
have somebody do that. And, Audrey and Rich, there's another person who I don't know if we would have necessarily without Plath, or at least not in the same way.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
Maybe
so
not the same version of the Rich
right.
that we ended up with. That, I mean, that's not so different from my own experience. I did not study. I was not an English major and didn't really do any proper English degrees. So my course of study was much more shambolic and circuitous. But yeah, I mean, my high school girlfriend, I dated a girl who was a couple of years older than me, and so I kind of read whatever she thought I should read, and she was really into Plath and Hughes, and I remember reading the Birthday Letters bunch, and reading. I think I just selected Plath, and a lot of, like, I knew a lot of depressed girls, some like in more grave
Yeah.
ways than others, and they were all really into her. I mean, I think, like, my impression of her was like she was maybe one of the first poets I read in whose work I took special note of the particularity of the language that I think often I would get either wound up in the larger spirit of the language or the flavor or as I did in her case, like the biography. But I think reading her poems, it was the first time I really looked at like, okay, just putting these words next to each other makes things more interesting in a way. I mean, as well as like in some cases, like, Sheep and Fog, which Perloff is not very happy, like 2 lines in includes the line like melts my heart. Which I think like, well, this is like if they're cliches, this is a cliche. But yeah, like it made me like reading her poems. I had to stop and actually consider word by word selection. But yeah, like beyond that, she has not been a really big poet in my for me, and neither has Hughes. I mean, I read the birthday letters, largely as sort of part of that mythology and part of like as a thing that my girlfriend was also really into, and then his animal poems I came back to later, and those are the ones I think I found most gripping. But yeah, both of them have been like, I mean, I think they're by the biographical mythology has so overshadowed the work, and I think like maybe not wrongly, and so like I don't know, it to me like some of Perloff pulling up Hughes poems and talking about how they're bad, and then pulling up Plath poems and talking about they're good, felt like, well, I don't know, I'm not crazy about either of these. you know
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that there's so many things to say about this.
yeah.
Um, I'll put my own cards on the table in terms of
Yeah,
what I
please.
love about Plath, and then
Yeah.
I do want to sort of touch on like Perloff's seemingly. We haven't mentioned that Perloff died. Have we mentioned this to your
Oh
readers
no,
already
no, no.
or
Yeah,
your
she died.
listeners?
She did die recently, and yeah, I had wanted to
Okay,
find some work of hers to talk about
good.
on the show, and so I'm glad you brought this in. And I may find some other stuff as well. But yeah, she did die recently. She was a major influential critic
Right.
of contemporary poetry, and I was talking to Jonathan about this the other night. Like she is somebody who seems to have had a real role as a critic in identifying the texture and topography of contemporary poetry.
Right, particularly on the avant-garde side.
Mm-hmm.
I am. She opened my eyes up to so many things. Not personally, she was at Stanford at one point, but not while I was
Yeah.
there.
Her writing,
And
yeah,
I
yeah,
never
yeah.
met her. Yeah, her writing was amazing. Between her and Helen Vendler, that was so often the way in which I moved through criticism. And it was like one of my graduate student cohort friends who said this. I can't remember if he's quoting Perloff or not. Let's just say he was, because it's a lovely line. He said, Helen Vendler writes about the poetry that is overread and under theorized, and Perloff writes about the poetry that is over theorized and underread.
It seems,
And I just love
sounds
that.
right.
Like, it seems like
Yeah,
it
yeah,
works
yeah.
well enough. Anyway,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That
for
sounds pretty right. Yeah.
yeah, the Plath that I keep rereading and finding so enchanting is the work in Ariel that sounds influenced by nursery rhymes. It
Hmm.
often is Plath at her most kind of extreme or hyperbolic or performative. Daddy is the most obvious example, which it's an intense poem. You can
Yeah,
make all sorts of arguments about her conflating herself with the Jews suffering the Holocaust. Like there's something
hmm,
really kind of like I hate the word problematic because it's a way of sort of like
sure.
marking something that you think is wrong, but you don't actually want to say why. But
But in
like
some
that
ways
would
also
be some of the
dated.
things that people
Like it feels like it may be something that if you were a poet writing at this moment, I mean, I wonder like which crises and which sets of vocabulary will feel that way 50 years from now.
right,
Like, yeah,
right,
she's picking
exactly.
it
It
up
feels
almost
very
as like
dated.
it's the available set of references for superlative suffering and evil.
Exactly. And she even talks about how this is sort of her writing a little bit about this is Plath writing to some extent about personal experience. I believe that one should be able to control and manipulate experiences, even the most terrifying, like madness, being tortured, this sort of experience. And one should be able to manipulate these experiences with an informed and intelligent mind. She goes on to say that such experiences should be connected to larger issues, the quote, bigger things such as Hiroshima and Dachau and so on. And I'm just sort of like, whoa, like, okay, you're going to yoke your own personal struggles, which are by no means inconsequential, to these international
Major
atrocities.
atrocities and yeah.
And it feels like her personal connection to those are I think today we would think of them as somewhat tenuous. Her dad was Russian. Do I have that right? I've got it in my notes, right? That, yeah, her father's a first generation Prussian immigrant who died when she was 8, Otto. Her mother grew up speaking German. So she felt kind of connected to Nazism through blood, even though she's, born American citizen. William Hayen, which I don't think many people read anymore, he does the same thing, which I remember reading him and finding that sort of a struggle. Anyway, I'm getting
at least
sidetracked
Perloff says here,
yeah.
there was no actual connection in her family to Nazis. Like her father was not a Nazi. I mean, he sort of is
No.
figured as a Nazi in some, in Daddy, but like that was not actually true to his own life or his own beliefs or anything. Yeah.
No, it's borrowed. I mean, on her part, it's a borrowed kind of. So Daddy, Lady Lazarus, Nick and the Candlestick. There's a poem called Secrets. I have to go back and pull that one. But there's some of these poems that have this beautiful sonic texture to them that I'll read over and over again. There's some that feel flabby and loose, and I kind of skip over them when I go back to Ariel.
Yeah.
There's one, it's Your, it's just YOU' that comes right after Daddy that I think is beautiful. And it's a poem.
You want to read it first? Is it? I don't know how long.
Oh, sure, yeah. It's pretty short. It's does it come after? Yeah. Yeah, it comes after Daddy. I think it's about her son. Your clown-like, happiest on your hands, feet to the stars and moon sculled, gilled like a fish. A common sense thumbs down on the dodo's mode, wrapped up in yourself like a spool, trawling your dark as owls do, mute as a turnip from the 4th of July to All Fool's Day. Oh, high riser, my little loaf. Vague as fog and looked for like mail, farther off than Australia. Bent-backed Atlas, our traveled prawn. Snug as a bud and at home like a sprat in a pickle jug. A creel of eels, all ripples. Jumpy as a Mexican bean. Right like a well-done sum. A clean slate with your own face on. Just love how playful that is sonically. The quickness of the figurative language.
Yeah, it also feels like I'm reminded of like in the 90s and like early noughts, there was a trend in avant curious poetry books of single word monosyllabic Anglo-Saxon titles. And unfortunately, the only one that comes to mind immediately is Haley Lighthouser's Swoop. But there was, and like she's a fine poet, but like there were a lot of these, and it feels in some ways like nice. Part of the legacy of Plath. Yeah, like you're right, because I hadn't thought about the nursery rhyme thing, but she does like one of the techniques she uses is the incorporation of conflicting tones, where she'll pick up sort of baby talk or like parent talk or this kind of stuff, but then infuse it with sometimes violent images, and that does feel like, I mean, even like Sexton had a not great collection of kind of fractured fairy tale poems, but like that, and I think of what's her name, Caroline Duffy, like that whole mode in particularly like late 20th century feminist writing feels like it may owe something to even like some of these smaller moves in Plath's poems.
And that's all over Daddy. I mean, Daddy is seemingly kind of a nursery rhyme that you read at night, those ooh sounds that just keep coming back. But then, it's rhyming with the word Jew, gobbledygoo, Luftwaffe, it's Panzerman, OU. So it gets, I had never
thought of it, but like, I mean, there's so much like blues in the texture of his writing, but I wonder if Kevin Young was because you do hear in some of those like very short lines, a lot of those kind of the concatenation of rhymes and internal rhymes and plays on words and slight, like snug as a bud. You have these slight slippages of idiom. I wonder if she might have been an influence for him. But obviously he's got a very distinct flavor to his poems.
That'd be a great question to pose to him. I teach those poems. I'm like one of those poems, one poem from Jelly Roll alongside Daddy when I'm doing, a 1 day lesson on sound poetry. Yeah, and I wonder to what extent maybe, I wonder if Plath was, I mean, I don't see any references to the blues in these poems, but there are a lot of topical references to like not moon landings, but moon flight, moons, Salamode. There's some stuff in there that's born of its day, but
and surely, like, I mean, lullaby, and even like, I don't know about you, but for me, like, when you're singing for like hours over years, over a month, over days and nights to babies, like traditional lullabies get worn through pretty quickly. They often become sort of like like adapted pop songs and things. So I mean, I have to imagine that she had like pop music in her ears as well, and that like it's obviously like it's even if you're not getting it directly from the blues, you're certainly getting the blues through pop music.
Oh, 100%. And the proximity of reading to her children to probably get them to go to sleep so that she could then go write has to be, a real part of this. I mean, she describes the time at which she was able to write the poems in Ariel as the blue hour. And these are her words. At about 4 a.m, that still blue, almost eternal hour before cockcrow, before the baby's cry, before the glassy music of the milkman settling his bottles. So that lullaby stuff has still got to be in her head.
Do you? I mean, I don't know when it. I mean, surely some version of it. I don't know what it would have been called, but like some version of it has existed since forever. But the I'm sure you have heard the term "purple hour" when raising kids.
Oh, I don't. No.
Well, I think maybe the older term, and probably the term she might have known, is witching hour, for basically like there is a period in like babies when they, for some reason, like it's not from birth, but like it begins at some point several months in, and then it ends at a point. But there's like a phase when it's very, very predictable that like babies will have this point in the evening when they just scream bloody murder uncontrollably, and there's kind of nothing you can do. And like I think hospitals and public health services started promoting information about it more, but I think in a way to in response to shaken baby syndrome, to say like, hey, your baby is going to scream, it's okay, it's just going to happen.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, very, very brief sidebar, but like when I read about it, I was shocked and horrified. Like shaken baby syndrome, there's like, it is not that nobody has ever abused a baby, which is horrifying to imagine, but like most of what people understand about shaken baby syndrome, including like why lots of people are not lots, why some people are in prison, is a myth. But like shaken baby syndrome as understood does not exist. But like basically,
really, okay,
yeah, there's like a very specific study done with monkeys being put on a sled and slammed into a brick wall down like horrible like torture of typical like crude.
Is this Harlow?
No. That's Harlow has. We got Harlow's a whole other story.
Other monkey abuse.
Other monkey torture.
Tons of monkey abuse.
That's the thing. It's like he was, as monkey torture goes, he gets a lot of grief, but like he was not. He was in some ways much better than some of his peers. But no, like there was a specific study done, which is where they got the pattern of like blood dispersal that they determined was responsible for shaken baby syndrome. It turns out like it's bunk science. Like it's not good science. And like the thing that they are talking about when babies turn up with these symptoms, that is not shaken baby syndrome. So like people have gone to prison because of bunk science. But total sidebar, we got to return to. But yeah, like I'm wondering about like she's referring to the blue hour. She's writing obviously, even when he not only like she discovers his affair and then he leaves her, which is all like, I mean, the affair is terrible, but like to me, that is so much like that she didn't kick him out. He up and left when she had an infant and a toddler.
Right.
Like it's insane.
Right.
So like, yeah, it's impossible to escape like early childcare in all of these poems. And so the idea of her like writing in the blue hour, like, I mean, as like very well, like having these certain portions of the day when you actually have a breath in which to think a thought, let alone maybe write a sentence.
And how precious that is. Yeah. It's how you survive. It's how you survive that time. And yeah, I mean, I sort of, but once you mention it, that he left her with a toddler and an infant,
Right.
it does become even more frightening and objectionable. And
Like
I say
like
that because I was
narratively,
trying
like
to read.
the sex is like the more like juicy part, but I don't know, but like
Right.
certainly like with early childcare, like the idea, I mean, first of all, the idea of having an affair is like who has the time, but also like I don't give a shit who you're sleeping with. Like who's taking care of the baby? Like,
Right.
sex goes way down Maslow's hierarchy during those months.
That's true. Yeah. I would say important to bring that up. And maybe for me, because I was perversely, this is my second time through Perloff's article, and I was perversely reading it, trying to come up with ways like, okay, let me like devil's advocate this,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah, yeah,
why would Hughes have done this? And I think that's actually healthy and useful to sort
yeah,
of
yeah.
think through
Of
that. And
course, yeah,
I do think that it doesn't seem like there's a good defense of him altering the manuscript because she left it like it was there, and
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah,
hard. I kept trying to find a way to sort of, I guess I'm pivoting a little bit to his
yeah, yeah, yeah.
textual sins as
Of
opposed to
course,
his
yeah, yeah.
paternal sins. His
Though,
paternal
though,
sins
though
are certainly
she,
a
I mean, she
problem.
ties those so closely together, it becomes very difficult to disentangle them. In reading the article.
Perloff does, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And I was trying to think what were his potential reasons. I mean, she mentions that perhaps it was he wanted to give a fuller picture of Plath, that those poems written right up into the end would give a greater sense of who she fully was.
yeah.
And maybe
Well, that
there's a
a
puzzle
lot of the
argument
poems
there.
she excluded that he included are poems written like up to the days before she killed herself. So it's not
Exactly.
even clear that like
Exactly.
if she had, say, survived and a month later put together a manuscript, it's not even clear that what she would have done with those poems.
Would they have even made it in? We don't know. Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Because we don't know how much of the manuscript she was still working on or touching up in late January, February of 1963.
yeah.
Yeah.
I
I
mean,
was wondering too if maybe he
yeah.
didn't have the same sense of, oh yeah. I
No,
was
no,
wondering too if
no.
he
Go
didn't
ahead.
have the same sense of ordering in sequence. Like that
Yeah,
Perloff does this really well. The article is wonderful in its close reading of sequence and the plot
yeah.
and narrative that you can create through poetic sequence. And
Yes.
that I find really sort of beautiful about it. And I wonder if Hughes just didn't appreciate that or didn't think of it as important. And it went back for me to Robert Lowell's life studies, which, Plath says, I've been very excited, I'm quoting her, by what I feel is the new breakthrough that came with, say, Robert Lowell's life studies, which comes out in, God, 1962. Shit. So that's right when she's working on this. And that final section of life studies after 91 Revere Street, it's like section 3. And then I think section 4 is like a series of poems that are very much what we think of as the define or opening sort of moment of confessionalism.
Yeah.
And I wonder if Plath was thinking about
And just
that
for
in
people
her ordering.
who might not already know
Yeah.
that particular turn, this is a big deal collection. 91 Revere Street is this prose interlude, but like for like my dad who reads some poetry and is
Yeah.
literate, but like might not know this like turn in poetic history. Would you give a little overview?
Yes, yes. And Robert Lowell is this, born into wealth. His name is on stuff at Harvard. Basically,
Mm-hmm.
he's related to, I think, the guy who discovered like Neptune or Venus, Percival Lowell. Amy Lowell, another poet, was one of
Right.
his relatives. And Lowell is really like one of the titan figures of poetry when Plath and Hughes are alive, American poetry
Yeah.
at least. They know him. They have a year where they go to Boston because almost their entire relationships happens in England.
Yeah.
Plath goes to England on a Fulbright scholarship, and Hughes sees her apparently, according to the birthday letters, in a photograph of the like Fulbright scholars, and he's like very taken with her. But one year during their relationship, they go back to Boston, and she teaches, I think, at Boston University, and Lowell is also teaching there. They know Lowell, and he's just a big deal. Like he's just, and
Yeah.
he begins as a very formal poet, kind of under the sort of tutelage of like the new critics at the time.
He
And he
camped out
makes
on
this
Alan Tate's
turn.
lawn. Like Alan Tate
Right.
tried to get rid of
That's
him. Oh sorry, he put up a tent on it. Like he was very very closely following them. But yeah, but then there's this development.
I love that story about him
Yeah,
being on the lawn. It's like this. He's like hobo. He's like so fucking excuse me. He's so fucking wealthy, right? Like
yeah,
he's
yeah, yeah.
so wealthy, and he's like a hobo on Alan Tate's lawn. Yeah. So with Life Studies, which comes out in 1962, he makes this turn towards what we now call confessionalism, which is a term
Yeah.
that's you can debate whether it's useful or not, but it's the assumption that like a poet is confessing something on the page, some amount of their personal life is being hashed out or worked out. through the kind of persona of the first person in the poem, that it's maybe not exactly Robert Lowell, it's some, extremer version of him.
Just like
And
arguably like also him. I mean, this is a guy who like was like like fiery manic depressive, went,
right.
at one point like broke into a stranger's house claiming to be John Milton, I believe. His
I didn't know
nickname
that one.
was Cal, short for Caligula, because he was
Right.
so I mean, he lived a very intense life and did, I mean, to be fair, like did a ton of damage to a lot of the people around him, but
Oh, totally.
was
Yeah.
a huge personal and poetic figure, and like makes this break both toward writing very very personal diaristic poems, but also like writing in free verse, writing 91 Revere Street is this prose chunk where he's sort of talking about his family history. I like, part of me wonders how much of confessionalism springs from, it almost reminds me of that, like that famous line of Nixon's, like when Robert Lowell writes versified diary entries, they're interesting. Like what he can do, like he
Yeah.
can write, like even what's the something in Lepke, like writing about being in jail for being a conscientious observer. Like, he can write these dumb little entries about dumb shit in his life, and it's delicious and fascinating. When I mean, he writes too much of it, and there's a lot that's not good. But like when he does it, it's interesting. And so then tons of people do it after him, and often it's very not interesting.
Yeah. Memories of West Street and Lepke,
That's it.
which
That's
is
it. Yeah,
part
yeah.
of the fourth section of life studies.
Which is a fun, like
Yeah.
and it, like it's a fun poem, but also like it shouldn't be. Like that's not a good idea for, like, no, it's not like a great, there's some interesting stuff there, but he just sort of writes out like some shit that happened, and it's fascinating when he does it.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think it's better than what he'll go on to do. We're obviously like sidebarring into Lowell.
Yeah,
It's much more interesting than the stuff that he's working on later in life, which are these sonnets, which just become these little Tupperwares of poetic thought that he just keeps filling over and over and over again.
yeah,
It's like he's
yeah,
pulling a lever, and it's like, here's what happened today. Here's what happened today. Here's what happened today. And
yeah,
out comes this like creamy poetic
yeah,
goo
yeah,
that he
yeah.
sticks in there, puts a lid on it, pushes it away, and then Frank Bedart sorts it all out and
Right.
like creates,
You,
anyway.
you you almost wonder if he, like, when there was a break being made, when it was like when the chemical reaction was fresh, and he was like making this turn toward this new way of writing. That's when this sort of like this like in order to put stuff into that collection, you imagine he had to be really confident that, like, okay, I know I'm doing something that's sort of the wrong idea, and not like, you're not supposed to do this. This is a weird thing. It's not really done. But like, this is too good. I can't let it go. Like, you wonder if that might have
Yeah.
been when confessionalism was born, and maybe he should have died. I don't know. Not that there isn't more, good
Yeah.
confessionalism after that, but maybe there are good confessional poems. I'm not sure confessionalism ever needed to be an ism.
Right. I mean, much of it I still find so beautiful and interesting and problematic. I mean, it's that boring, crappy word, but like
Yeah, yeah,
open to valid and interesting criticism.
totally.
I'm thinking of John
Including by his
Ferryman's
friends, like, and
right,
family
right.
members who were often scandalized by
Bishop,
stuff he
right?
wrote.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Elizabeth Bishop, famous. Anyway, so we've. I'm going to try to circle us back
Yeah.
to
Those
a
62
Plath.
Life Studies comes out, but yeah, and he also
So
writes the
maybe that's an
introduction to
influence,
Ariel after her death.
right?
A very, I
Right,
mean, as she quoted
exactly.
from it, like I felt embarrassed for him, like a very sensationalistic introduction.
Exactly. This woman is playing Russian roulette with 6 bullets in the chambers.
Yeah, 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 really, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't. I'm trying to. It's still trying to figure out if there's anything I can salvage of Ted Hughes's choice here, and probably there isn't. I mean, if anything, it's like he's obviously trying to protect his kids, which he felt
Yes,
very
he says that
keen
explicitly.
to. He says that explicitly, and he's and
Mostly with her diary stuff that he destroys, but also with some of the poems. Yeah,
right. And I wonder sometimes whether his critics are more upset about the burning of the diaries than about the rearranging of Ariel. Which the thing that bothered me the most in reading this the first time and then the second was that he took her manuscript and he changed it. That bothered me. And the fact that he burned some of her diaries, I guess it should get me worked up. I mean, you
yeah,
probably
yeah.
shouldn't burn anyone's diaries, but
Right.
there's lots of people whose diaries get burned afterwards, whose personal letters get burned afterwards. Emily Dickinson's letters look like somebody was playing with scissors and creating fine art with like
Right.
what was
Yeah.
cut out. And we don't get as mad about that. I mean, I guess it's because there's such an attachment to the Plath
Yeah,
biography.
we don't have like a personal narrative in her life that we're invested in the way we are with Plath and
Right.
Hughes.
With Plath.
I yeah,
Yeah. So
I have.
yeah.
It's funny. I have similar and different instincts to you because I think with you, I think yeah, like burning her diaries seems like definitely not not a good choice. But also, I don't care that much about. I mean, honestly, like I don't care that much about most poets' diaries or most poets' letters. There's some wonderful
Right.
stuff that comes out of some of them, but for the most part, like I'm not what it will be is email, right? The email paper, and like in some ways, you're
Right.
going to have more, but also maybe less interesting. And like, I
Right.
definitely want all of my email to be destroyed when I die. Like, not that anybody will care,
Right.
but God forbid anybody did care. So, like, that to me
Yeah.
is not as precious. To me, like, there are like three or four questions to like that I with which I like break down this choice that he made to change the manuscript. So one is order, right? And that's what Perloff really emphasizes is the order of the poems and how this affects the meaning in she calls it
Right.
Arial 1, which is Plath's ordering, and then Arial 2, which is Hughes's ordering. The order matters a lot to Perloff. My own feeling is that order matters almost not at all, which I know is probably extreme as well. But then another question is intention, right? Like the author's intention for the order of the poems, and as well as the inclusions and exclusions, and
Yeah. Yeah.
that certainly matters. But also, I think I take that with a grain of salt as well, because so many authors have had, like, so often the poet himself or herself doesn't necessarily have the best instincts. And it's like, you're
Yeah.
glad that there's a good editor on hand. Now, should that editor have been the like totally estranged, like separated husband that she had major, like, probably he should not have been the guy who did it. Although he also
Right.
knew her very well as a poet, like was as a poet, so I mean, my feeling is like he probably should have been involved, but he should not have had final say.
Right.
Um,
Final say.
and then the other like the two big questions, and to me like the much more significant ones are exclusions and inclusions. Like I care much less about the order of the poems than like which poems did you exclude and which poems did you include, really even more than what did you include that maybe Perloff would not have wanted you to include, or Plath would not have wanted you to include. What did you exclude? And I think like what I found really striking is that Perloff is writing this after the publication of the collected poems. And in the collected poems, and
Right.
it's called collected, but to be clear, it is closer to a complete because it does include a lot of poems that are not in any of the collections. So
Right.
like there's this
And
slight
if I
distinction.
remember
Collected
correctly,
poems, technically are often like if you're it's strictly speaking, collected poems is just the poems that were collected in books. But here and
right.
in most cases, it's not only the poems that were collected in books, it's also poems that were not collected, including the poems he left out of Ariel. Um, he
That's an
publishes a
important
collected,
distinction. And
yeah, he
yeah.
publishes a collected, and in that he also he not only includes the poems he left out of Ariel, but he also includes, as you said, like these notes explaining what he did as an editor. And what I found really striking is that her response to this is how sad that we might never have the real Ariel, meaning like the Ariel
But
as
he
she
just
presented.
provided it.
Right. And my thought is like, well, what's better that like isn't the collected better than the real? Like what you want is all of the poems to choose from and a sense of what happened to them. I don't honestly like I don't need a manuscript of Ariel that has the poems in that order. I want to have all of the poems and be able to make choices from what's there.
Yeah, it's a good point. And I mean, it is one of the things that gets lost a bit in this shuffle is that
Mm-hmm.
without Hughes could have destroyed the original manuscript.
Yeah,
Hughes
yeah,
could have
yeah, yeah.
destroyed the ordering. He does preserve it, and he does
Yeah.
offer it to readers to make the kind of more sort of a la carte way of reading that you're describing.
Yeah.
And it does seed the ground with the opportunity to create this restored Ariel that comes out in 2004. That would not have happened if Hughes hadn't put that stuff in there. It also, I would argue, probably wouldn't have happened if Perloff didn't kind of start this conversation in terms of thinking about this as a complete book that has a beginning, middle, and end. And the way that Plath intended it has a particular rejuvenation or movement towards hope, as opposed to the way that Hughes put it together.
So I had never read this article. Did this article have an influence on other critics and other like readers of Plath? Like when she put out this article saying, "Hey, here's what happened with the ordering. Here's why it's significant." This was then an influential article. I had never read it until now, but I'm also not a scholar. I'm not somebody who would read these things.
I'm not really a scholar either. I don't have a full answer to that question. I was reading a little bit of Plath criticism in preparing for this because we were thinking about doing something. You and I were thinking about doing something having to do with literary couples and marriage and collaboration. And in the articles that I saw about the two of them, this piece, Perloff's piece, does come up. So I presume that it's part of the conversation. I don't know how important a part of the conversation it is.
Yeah. I thought it's funny. In addition to like author's intention, which again I think like matters, but maybe shouldn't be gospel. Like you definitely should need to take the author's intention into account. I don't know that authors. I mean, in fact, authors definitely don't always have their best literary interests at heart. I think of like Kafka, Virgil, Nabokov, who all would have like burned their major works. And I'm glad that their executors didn't listen to them, or their spouses in some cases. But I think also of the intention of Hughes' choices, because I think you're right that like it definitely seems to be the case that he took liberties that were not his to take. Certainly in destroying manuscripts, it didn't destroy poems, but he left out poems. He reordered. He did things that were not really, probably should not have been left to him to do. But I think also of, and you suggested something about this earlier, like one of the standards we've come to consider in like jurisprudence today is, well, it matters what the law states and what it intends, but it also matters what effect it actually has. Like if part of civil rights legislation is like, if we're going to examine whether or not this law is like racially discriminatory, it matters both whether it says something about that, but it also matters like what effect is it having? How does it actually end up, even if you don't explicitly say this poem discriminates against Black people, if the net result is that it does, well, then like that matters. That's like, and so as you said, with Hughes, Perloff is very, very aggressive in attributing intention to his choices. But if we step back and ask, like, but what's the effect? Yeah. Like the effect is like most people love Plath and hate Hughes. She is revered. She is treated as this sort of, this genius. I mean, and even from the very get-go, like too much, there is an equation between her going crazy or her being depressed and her being a genius. And that's not good or responsible or even accurate. But I don't know that, like, if you just look at the effect of his editorial choices, I'm not sure the result is that it's actually self-serving for Hughes or it's actually belittling of Plath. Like, I don't know if that's what comes out of it.
Yeah, I think that that's right. And I sometimes find her readings of some of the individual poems to be just sort of like, they sort of like almost miss the case in terms of how the reception of Plath has been shaped one way or the other, regardless of what Hughes would say. So for instance, on page 15 of the American Poetry Review, the page that has this really terrible picture of Kenneth Patchen in one of the advertisements for a book. He just looks like he's on
a very unconvincing like totally advertisement. Drunk. I was not moved to go look up and read Kenneth Patchen after looking at this advertisement.
No, it's terrible. But Perloff makes the case that Daddy, so she writes, ironically, Daddy is a safe poem, and hence Hughes publishes it because no one can chide Plath for her Electra complex, her longing to get back to the father who died so prematurely, whereas the hatred of Hughes, there is a stake in your fat black heart, is much more problematic. I don't know if I buy that. I don't think Daddy feels like a safe poem. I don't feel like Daddy is exclusively about Otto Plath. I feel like Daddy is one of the poems that we almost always, whether we want to or not, end up reading about Ted Hughes. And I don't think Hughes did himself any quote unquote favors by including that poem in the book. I mean, I think that gets read very often as being about Ted Hughes. So I'm not sure how much she changed, or I'm not sure how much Hughes was able to totally change the trajectory of his reputation with this construction. Maybe in the short term, maybe in the sort of first few years after the books come out.
But she also, like, she it's like Perloff's standards do seem to shift continually, where like there are cases where, and that Daddy is one of the examples where like she will cite that Hughes's choices were in some cases very consistent with Plath's explicit statements, but she will then she'll basically say like, oh, but Plath was under his wicked influence when she said that, and that was not the real, like, we should not take Plath's intention seriously when she says Daddy is about an electrocomplex, but we should take Plath's intention seriously when she says this other thing. And she gives Hughes a lot of grief for like leaving his name, like not saying that he edited Ariel, leaving his name out of the book in all instances. But like, how much grief would she have given him if he had put his name in the book at all? Like, if he had said edited by Ted Hughes, like that, surely that would not have pleased her. I did feel a little bit like she kind of wanted to have her cake and eat it too in a few cases where like she wants the narrative to be Hughes caused Plath to kill herself, but also after learning about his betrayal, Plath arrived at this place of hope, and that's how the book should have ended. But then also Plath killed herself. And I feel like it doesn't seem like a very reasonable account either of Plath's life or of mental illness. That, like, I don't know that, like, oh, it wasn't a matter of fate. It wasn't a matter of chemistry. It was a matter of him being a mean husband. Like, I don't know that that's accurate. And I definitely know that, like, my psychiatrist wife would be appalled by that reading. Like, that was the whole, like, all of the mental health professionals who were scandalized by that show, 13 Reasons Why. There's a YA novel called 13 Reasons Why, and then a show that was a Netflix show that was produced, an adaptation of it. It was very, very popular. The premise of the book and the show is a high school student kills, I forget if it's a boy or a girl, kills herself and leaves behind a list of 13 reasons why she killed herself. And it's basically a hit list of all of the mean people who did mean things. And here's why. And so it's like, oh, you kill yourself, and then after you're dead, all of your enemies are punished, and and there's this glorious story told explaining everything. Like, it's exactly the opposite of what, like, all media guidelines, all psychiatric readings of suicide, like, and this feels a little bit like that. Like, Hughes was an asshole. Definitely Hughes took liberties. Definitely, like, I am also not particularly impressed by his poetry. Without question, his poetry has had less of an impact than hers. But I'm not sure that like Perloff's depiction of him as like an out and out villain, like simultaneous buffoon and Svengali, it rings true.
Certainly not today. I mean, and I wonder if it's even fair in 1984 when she's writing this. I mean, that's a very good point, that it's basically trying to attribute guilt and or cause to the death. There's certainly cause for the textual sort of, corruptions, but she's trying to basically pin the death on Hughes. And there's so many more things going on with Plath than that. I mean, it's, this is a person who tried to kill herself, I think 3 times and was successful on the 3rd time. And there's I mean, you'd be able to answer this question, I presume, better than I would, being married to a psychiatrist, but we're not in the era where the kind of pharmaceutical, what am I looking for, treatment of these sort of illnesses, or perhaps even the understanding of these illnesses, is mature enough that we can, certainly not in 1960s, I don't know about 1984 when this is written, that, we have a way of sort of like helping Plath, right? To go back in time and help Plath, she probably needed something, well, I don't know, I'm not going to presume to know what Plath would need, sort of. But the idea that you're right, that it is just Hughes's fault, Hughes screwed it up, does a disservice to Plath, right? It does a disservice to the real struggle that is mental illness, and it tries to say, oh, it's just this one cause. And that's reductive. That's not the life she lived.
And reading this, I mean, we're talking mostly about the 2 Ariels essays she writes about Hughes' editorship of Ariel, she also, as you said, it just, I don't know if I've ever read a more scathing review of a single collection of poems, but her review of the birthday letters in 1997
Birthday
is
letters?
just like hilariously disdainful. Like she hates him and this book so much. I did feel a
Yeah.
little bit like I mean, in that review, at least it does focus slightly more on like, let's look at the poems, though not that much. It made me think like, I don't, confessionalism, I'm very ambivalent. It's not my favorite, but I do recognize there's some great and major poets who are associated with it. And there's some wonderful
Yeah.
poems that come out of that. Boy, what I definitely know I don't need any more of is confessionalist criticism, like the criticism of poetry that
That's a
just
key.
like totally marries biography with text and reads
Right.
every line. So, like the poetry creates the life and the life creates the poetry in this seamless mesh. Like that I find so tiresome. And I find myself wanting to step
And
back and say, like, let's respect both Plath and Hughes as poets slightly more. Like, let's
right.
actually just look at the text and see what's there a little bit.
And
Like,
that does feel like
yeah,
yeah, that definitely feels like a place where Perloff is having her cake and eating it too, because she seems to be in the opening to the article about Ariel, criticizing the male folks who are doing the early reviews of Ariel, and criticizing the way that they're conflating these two things and turning her into this like, and Lowell's the beginning of this like firecracker poet, a comet streaking through the sky soon to burn out, all this other stuff, conflating the poetry and the life. And yet it feels like Perloff is doing that so very much in both of these articles as well. Even though I think Hughes mentions this, Perloff I think quotes him, that Plath thought of poems as having personas, that there's a mask that she's putting on. And at the end of this book, there's quite literally mask that she's putting on in the form of the bee mask with these bee poems.
yeah,
Um, and Perloff doesn't give a ton of room for that, because it does feel that she comes into the fight with a a desire to take down Hughes. And there's a lot of good reasons to take him down, right? But it does feel like she's coming in with that. I kind of want to like touch like really quickly on the bee
please.
poems, not like for any
Yeah,
great
yeah, yeah.
length,
No,
but
no, because I like the poems I was rereading right before sitting down were Herda, which she picks up as saying like this is
yeah,
one of her most accomplished poems, and he left it out of the manuscript. And then Wintering, which was the original poem she ended with, and he did include that, but then he added 11 poems after that, and he ends with
right,
Words, which Plath excluded, and that was one of the last
right.
poems she wrote. And those three felt like kind of interesting touchstones in terms of Perloff's assessment of the manuscript and the manuscript changes. But yeah,
Right.
talk about the bee poems a little bit, because she says like these are some of Plath's very best poems, and this was where Plath wanted the manuscript to end.
I agree with the second statement, but not the
Yes,
first.
yeah, yeah, me
Yeah.
too.
And I think they work really interestingly as the end of the book. And they do
Yeah,
create a really fascinating sequence. If we begin with Daddy, and then we move all the way to the last poem, Wintering, there's a really beautiful sequence that I do teach this a little bit with my students, but it's always a little, I can never quite get to a lot of these, most of these points, because it's all of it's very, very new. So I find all of that, the sequence of it really interesting. That said, I think a lot of the bee poems feel to me flabby and just prosy. The very first bee poem is really long lined. It's very, very unlike the previous
yeah,
Plath poems. So if you begin with Daddy, you have a poem that's, about perhaps a variety of things, but certainly about the masculine sort of ideal, not ideal, but some masculinity looming over her life. Then you go on to this poem, Your, which I read earlier, and it's about the next generation, I would argue. It's about men, but it's about Nicholas, her son, doing these like sort of dances around the room. And there's a little bit of hope and playfulness there. So you're already starting to make this transition. And then you have these bee poems which show up, which kind of carry us all the way to the end of the manuscript. And we have a mask that's being put on. We have something of a rebirth. We're entering into a matriarchy, which,
yeah,
bees would be, I guess we would argue for, right? Because
yeah.
they have a queen. I think that there's an undercurrent here of that epic simile, and I think it's book 2 of the Aeneid, where Dido and her world at Carthage is described as this busy as bees,
And
with this, and it's
she's
all
the
run
like
by a woman.
the widow, and who swore not to marry, and so she's leading this
Right,
nation as a female king, basically. Yeah,
right. Yeah. So I think that there's a little bit of that going in there. You have Plath entering this beekeeping group in England. So, from isolation of parenting late at night, to group acceptance, or at least sort of social life, right? Which is what we as parents sort of, when you finally can sort of like go out and do stuff again, it's really sort of
Right,
amazing.
yeah. It
And then
almost
it all
doesn't
sort of
matter what
multiple.
dumb hobby it is. You just like, let me go
Yeah,
do something with adults.
right.
Yeah.
I'll do anything, right? Like I'll do those terrible wine and painting things that
Oh
I guess
God, yeah,
people
yeah,
like.
yeah. And I can't remember if you mentioned this,
And
but
then,
her dad was also a
oh yeah,
beekeeper. But yeah, Otto
right.
Plath was a
Yeah, and her
beekeeper.
dad was a
Yeah, so
beekeeper.
that's yeah. Though here it definitely does not seem to
And
be at all a tribute to her dad. She says the bees are all women,
no,
maids and the long royal lady. They have got rid of the men, the blunt, clumsy stumblers, the
yes,
bores. Winter is for women.
yeah,
Which to me feels
yes,
a little
yes.
bit
Those are
like,
some of the
yeah,
lines that, yeah,
there's a store up the street from our house. We live in like a southeastern version of Portlandia, but there's a store right up the street from our house called Womancraft, which is just like literally crafts made by women, and God bless them, and they've been there forever. But it
right,
feels a little bit
right.
like this would be something like stitched on a sampler and sold at Womancraft. Getting rid of the men are
Exactly,
so clumsy and boorish. Let's get rid of them. Winter is for women.
right,
And to me, it feels like this
right,
is this self-mythologizing. I mean, in some ways, the self-mythologizing feels like the more boring parts of Hughes. Like I find him very tiresome when he does his like
right,
macho self-mythologizing, but it also feels like sort
right.
of paint by numbers feminism. Like she is a
Yeah,
weirder and more singular poet than this. And looking at Wintering
yeah.
next to Words, I kept thinking like Words is definitely more fatalistic. I also think it's just a better poem.
And I wonder if that's what Hughes was thinking too, that he saw the bee poems and he saw them as lesser. And he probably, I could easily see him
Didn't it
reading those
didn't
lines that you
help
just
it didn't help that
quoted.
they were anti-men or they were pro, like I'm sure that was
Right,
like he like, was he a misogynist? Sure. Was he shitty to the women in his life? Sure. I'm sure that didn't, but like I have to imagine he also, as you're saying, like had a critical eye as a poet, right? And was trying to,
right.
at least to some extent, put forth good poems.
And I think that he could easily see these bee poems as, yeah, not being as good. I mean, I think that they get a little bit better as the book goes on. I think the last one might be the strongest, and the first one's definitely the weakest. Yeah, and like you have like the bee box arrives, that's what, and for Plath, that's the fourth to last one. So it's sort of like, there's an expansion or a sort of growing community with the additional sort of bee box showing up. I wonder if like Pandora's box isn't also one of the sort of kind of myths that are underneath this, right? With a bee
Hmm.
box, right? That it's such a chauvinist myth. It's such a like, oh, all the badness in the world is from a woman opening a box and not knowing
Right.
what's going on. And then you
And
have
it's weird. It's
Plath.
like, let me make a woman so that there can be a dum dum to open this box. Like it's such a weird. It's like it's a
Right,
very bizarrely contrived myth. Like I need to invent a woman to be dumb enough to open this box. Yeah,
right.
and
It's
so you're
all,
right. Like
yeah,
this
yeah.
is a much richer box, and it's one that's like, no, we're going to cultivate something in this box. This is not just open and shut. This is something we're going to build something that is alive in
Exactly.
here. Um,
Exactly. And it produces something. It produces something sweet. And honey is one of the foods that lasts almost forever. It never really goes bad. It'll harden and all that other stuff,
yeah,
but
yeah,
if you can
yeah. But
scoop it
it's
out, it's
yeah.
still good. People have found human heads encased in honey. They're
Oh,
buried. I wrote this in a poem ages ago, and somebody would like find a head buried in the ground and it would be encased in honey. You could still eat the honey. I don't know why you would want to, because it had like a human head inside of it. But
well, it's like I
and I
don't know if
wonder
you, yeah, it's like scorpion wine, or like if you're traveling in Vietnam, you'd see like jars of alcohol with various animals preserved inside, and like it was, as with like mezcal, it was
he
considered like, well, that's part of what
right,
gives it the flavor. Like, yeah, why wouldn't you want scorpion wine? What, yeah,
yeah, and you're supposed to eat the worm, right? So there you
yeah, yeah,
go.
yeah,
Like
right,
that shows
yes,
that
that's
you're a man.
yeah.
Yeah,
Then so when you're done with the honey, you eat the head.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I feel like the honey, it might be like a sort of metaphor here for the poetry, the thing that is laid down that you can come back to. I mean, and that does sort of show what Perloff's trying to get at with this sequence at the end, that there is something sort of beautiful in how she's sequenced this and thought through a kind of end metaphor of, honey, that you can sort of like have for later. And the final poem, sort of has a really lovely sort of hopeful ending, right? The bees are flying, they taste the spring. But I don't think that they're the strongest poems in the book.
No, and I think there were some good poems she wrote after that were not in her version of the manuscript, and so I think like it's very easy to say like Ted Hughes was not shouldn't have been the one guy running this show and made some bad choices. But I also wonder if we just imagine a totally different editor, like somebody not in their marriage, a female editor who was just not somebody directly involved at all. I can't imagine that they, like a thoughtful poet or person with an eye for poetry would not have also made some adjustments. Like I can't imagine
Right.
that this person would not have also added in some poems, and like maybe would not have taken out the poems that Hughes didn't like. But like even with Perda, I don't know. Perloff really says like this is one of her best poems. I really don't know that it
I don't
is.
see it.
It's
I
it
don't
is. I
see it.
mean,
I've
and I
read
think
that one
like
so many times.
and Purdah is a term for in Islamic cultures the separation of men and women, and it is very much written as a like in the voice of a sort of wealthy but sequestered Muslim woman. I mean, I think like we today certainly would read this as like screaming Orientalism, though though also like it sort of is critical of some of the misogyny present in Islamic cultures in a way that like we are more squeamish about pointing out today. And I think like not all not always. I mean, I think like in some ways like she's a little bit franker about some of that than we would be. But yeah, this to me seems much less. He says he has a term that is very suspect that Perloff cites a few times, where he says he took out some of the more aggressively personal poems, and that feels like I get why she would read that as being self-exculpatory, that he's like, I want to take out the poems where she's being personally aggressive to me. But whether he's
Right.
making the right choices or not, or whatever his intentions are, it does seem like in some cases with her poems, as well as with like poems of any poet I know, there are cases where your raw, like your raw feeling and chip on your shoulder in a personal way comes through too much, and you haven't transformed it enough to turn it into a poem that can really be valuable for others. Like that is a real flaw that lots of poems have, and they tend to be poems that the poet herself is not all that good at identifying as such. Like that's part of why you have
Because it's so
readers, is to
close.
tell you like,
Right.
this one
Yeah.
is too close. You can't see it because it's too close.
Right. Yeah. And she didn't get that reader. And Plath didn't
No,
really get that reader.
no, and like
Yeah.
whether or not Hughes could ever have been that reader,
Yeah.
his
Seems unlikely.
selection is like too tainted for us to be able to read it. Like he maybe some of his choices were good, definitely some were bad, but like we can't trust his judgment in this case.
Right. I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah. I feel like I need to mention this because
Please.
it was one of the things that I couldn't not notice. You were talking earlier about how Perloff seems to give Plath passes for bad lines and rails against Hughes when he has bad lines in birthday letters. And I definitely felt that when I was reading these. And it's interesting, like looking at his birthday letters poems, it does feel like he's starting to imitate Plath in ways that aren't necessarily very good for him. But the thing that struck me as like the most, what's the word, kind of almost hypocritical on Perloff's part was that she calls out Hughes in a review in 1998 of birthday letters for using exoticizing sort of racist language to describe Sylvia Plath's body.
Which Sylvia Plath does all the time.
All the time. And I'm just like rereading Ariel and I'm like,
yeah,
I didn't remember the N-word being in this book.
Oh yeah,
and
there's some like very
like
jarring like racist, like whether sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's extremely not subtle. I had that same thought. To play devil's advocate for Marjorie Perloff, I wonder if part of it is not like it's like by 1998 you should know better. Like if he's doing it 30 odd years after she's doing it, and you think like you're still describing, like you're saying she has African lips, like what is wrong? Come on, guy,
right,
like
exactly.
Jesus Christ. So I mean, but yeah, you're right. I think she definitely gives Plath a pass when it comes to some like very alarming racist language, and again, like I think as is very often true, I don't like, did she have racist intentions in her heart? probably not, but like also the language is definitely racist. And like, again, like what is the effect on people who read it? You know, like whatever her intentions, whatever it's in her heart, like people, and I know like really good Black poets who have loved Sylvia Plath and then read some of these poems and be like,
Oh, sure.
Jesus Christ, what the fuck is this? Like,
Right.
It's understandably off-putting and upsetting. You know, and it certainly is, you know, even if you're white, it's like, as you said, like, boy, I love this poem up until the N-word berries came. Like, what the fuck is this?
Right, exactly. Like, why is it? And like in the arrival of the bee box, I put my eye to the grid. I think she's looking at the grid of the box with all the bees in it. It is dark with the swarmy feeling of African hands, minute and shrunk for export, black on black, angrily clamoring. And I'm just sort of like, wow.
That got real gross.
And I mean, it got real gross.
That was my conversation with Derek Mong. You can go check out When the Earth Flies into the Sun, as well as At Length, and the new issue of 32 Poems. You can hear the second half of my conversation with Derek later this week on The Secret Show at SLEERICKETS.substack.com. Again, I think that's one like Alice will like and Brian will either love or be furious at. I can't predict. It's always hard with him. He's furious so much. What an angry guy. You can reach me, as always, at SLEERICKETS@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.